Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Andrew Turner, founder and host of the G&T Sessions podcast. And today we have a new guest, Mr. Scott Newton. How are you, Scott?
I'm very well, thanks. And how are you doing today, Andrew?
Very, very good. Thank you. Thanks for joining the show today. I suppose to kick it off, whereabouts are you joining from? Which exotic location are you in? Because I know you're a bit of a gadabout, a bit of a kind of like, if not on a plane or a boat or a train, you're actually staged for today, which is a refreshing change.
Fair comment. Yeah, I'm back in my office, which is in Northeast Italy. So I'm in between Milan and Venice in the Veneto region. I'd love to say it's a beautiful day, but actually it's pouring rain. So it's kind of normal January.
You can't say that. It shatters my illusion of Italy, like just think about the Amalfi Coast and, like about people just sat in the sunshine eating pizza.
Yeah, here in North Italy, we just sit in the factory working. So it's good.
Okay. No problem. So yeah, thanks for coming on the show. So I mean, we spoke recently, and I think one of the things that I wanted to kind of get you on the show early in 2025 was because I'd been obviously admiring your very poignant and thoughtful stuff on LinkedIn, and then when we spoke, it kind of even more amplified the need to come on the show. So one of the things we do with the G&T sessions is, G&T is about growth and technology. Actually, somebody said it should be growth and transformation, apparently, but it's a bit mouthy. I think the tech thing's a bit shorter, but also with gifted and talented people. So I know we'll get into the kind of stuff that you're doing, but one of the things that I was thinking about as we're now racing towards the end of January in 2025 was something that resonated when we spoke about how do people deal with things like strategy in this kind of. I know if you put your kind of military hat on with, what the US Navy SEALs call VUCA, which I'll let you jump into that if you want to go down that rabbit hole. But one of the things I was thinking about was actually having a conversation about strategy and thinking about how does that apply? Is it more important? Is it less important? Is it just kind of like, get that strategy offsite binder and put it on the shelf and make it collect dust and see you next year? Yeah. Or does it actually you have to collapse the time scale, have to make it more dynamic? And I suppose I just wanted to have a conversation with you about that because I thought that was an important topic to go through.
Yeah, this is a question I'm getting asked a lot currently from our clients in terms of, what do we do if the environment feels very volatile? And for many organizations, especially those that are operating globally, the environment feels very volatile and uncertain to them at the moment. And my suggestion is that you need strategy more when you're in an uncertain environment than when you're in a stable environment. And so when you're in a stable environment, you can kind of take incremental planning and say, well, we can make this a little bit better and we could reduce this a little bit and you can adjust the levers and it's quite calm and easy. But now we get into a very volatile environment where we don't know what tomorrow could bring. And so the strategic direction and vision become even more important. And strategy is not a plan that we can do once a year. I like your analogy of the binder. Many organizations actually have a binder, but that's not the way strategy works. So what I'm seeing, what I'm working on is we have a series of assumptions about the future. The board and the management team together have agreed on the implications of those assumptions. And then we monitor those in as close to real time as possible, looking for those future or leading indicators, something that author Rita McGrath calls weak signals that tell us that something may be changing in the environment. And we are carefully watching those and then adapting our strategy and updating our plan. But when we have that structure in place, two things happen. One, we go out of panic mode. So we're able to take better decisions because we're clear-headed. And two, people feel much more comfortable working in this environment because they know, okay, there is a structure, there is a process. Yes, it's going to be highly chaotic at some points in time, but actually we're ahead of that curve. And so we're ready for it, whatever that may be.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, if you think about that definition of VUCA, you mentioned some of the words already: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, and we're now. What are we now? I think we're literally. I think today we're literally a week following Mr. Trump going back into the US government as the president, and I don't know about you, but something seems to happen every day, which is quite kind of sending either positive, either good or not so good vibes across different directions, I suppose, which is something to cope with as well.
So, yeah, I mean, the political environment at the moment is not what anyone would call particularly stable, and not just the United States. I mean, we have France that is on the verge of an election, Canada without a prime minister, Germany about to have an election, a lot of questions in the UK. So I can't point to many countries that have very stable governments today, in the Western economies especially. But what I do recommend is to get out of the media cycle, which is something that some politicians love to use and drive on a daily basis, and look at the underlying policies and look at what are the big investors doing. So, I say, what's JP Morgan doing? What are Citibank doing? Because they have billions, if not trillions, on the line, and they're not sitting and waiting to say what's going to happen next. So they have an idea. And that's when I come back to strategic assumptions. Everybody has assumptions about the future. It's just how confident are you in those assumptions? And then coming back to, let's step away from the media hype cycle, which can be very distressing. And especially now that it's almost in real time with these social media platforms. And, Colombia has tariffs. Colombia doesn't have tariffs. Colombia is blocked. Colombia is welcome. If you just tune that out and then say back to, okay, right, what's the big picture with Latin America economies and how they're working? What's the big picture with European economies? And do not get into the media hype cycle, because it will drive you crazy. And there's no reason to do it. It's not giving you any information that is factual. It's just giving you the soundbite of the moment, as opposed to what's going on for our business and what decisions do we have to take so that we can protect our interests and make sure we're doing the best for our people and our customers.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, I was laughing. Well, I was laughing, but kind of like going, oh my God. I think it was yesterday when, you're seeing a plane didn't land in a certain South American country, and then suddenly a policy was issued, an executive order. I mean, I just think it's just like, how can you plan a business or run a business when if you are so, if your nose is like this to the YouTube stream. So, but the reason I mentioned it was because obviously I wanted to have a little discussion about it, because I agree with you. You've got to like switch all notifications off, stop all your subscriptions to all your inbound news feeds, and put a piece of wood over your post box so you don't get any newspapers delivered to you, and then you'll be okay.
Well, I have heard some people say that they're being very intentional about when they're looking at the media and how long they're looking at the media for. And I think that's good too, because you can get into this real-time news cycle, and then it's just sucking time that you don't have. So, I mean, personally, I read the Financial Times in the morning and the evening. And if there's something so urgent that's going to happen in between those two time periods, I'm quite confident someone's going to phone me. So, and say, you need to know. So, and I think that's enough that of course, in business, we have to stay up to date on the big changes, but we also have to be realistic on what can we do about them. And so that's when it comes back to more, what choices can I take about my environment to make sure that I am protecting my plans, my people, my customers, and what's reasonable and what's just outside the scope of what anyone can manage. And so just staying focused on that. And the big picture is the waves are moving a little bit faster, but it's still the same ocean. So
that's a great line, actually. The waves are still, that's fantastic. I love that. Because I mean, I suppose that's why I mentioned the binder. So I remember in my previous life, in the corporate life, before I escaped that corporate life, you could say, or transitioned to something else, we used to have this ceremony every year in one of the businesses that I was operating in. And it would, be a 12-week countdown to this strategy offsite, yeah, with all the great and the good in a nice location, not in the office, with all the great and the good and a very tight agenda and strategic questions to be posed, and binders to be bound, and dust to be collected. And then how do you come off that with all this high energy, and we're gonna conquer the world tomorrow? And then how do you keep it sustainable? How do you keep that momentum? How do you keep it alive? I suppose in your travels today, because I know you travel a lot and you working with lots of different organizations across different sectors. how are you seeing people? Are people falling into that cycle, or have they actually started to change the way that they do it to make it more modern, you could say? Because I think that's the example I gave you is a bit, I wouldn't say it's Dickensian, but it's kind of like it's a bit, you couldn't, to my mind, what do you respond to in what cycle time, and what's the appropriate response? It's the kind of classic fishbone, the cause and effect piece. Any thoughts on that?
Right. So I think the way that organizations are working on strategy is much different now. And this is partly because the world is sped up. And what I love about your show here, I mean, the technology piece of this is a big part of it. So technology is not working on yearly cycles. And for organizations, what we can do is we can begin to look at strategy as options theory and saying, how do we leave our options open? We know the direction we're traveling in. We know the customers that we want to serve, and we know what their unmet needs are. And now, based on everything new that's happening, how do I serve those customers? And monitoring, are those always the same customers, or will my customers be changing as well? And so revisiting that. And this comes back to something where there are indicators that you look at weekly, and there are indicators that you look at monthly. And in some cases, there could be things that you look at every day, but I think most of them are weekly, monthly, and kind of quarterly reviews. So I do see organizations that are updating on a quarterly basis in terms of strategic objectives. Financial, of course, they'll do rolling month by month, just because there are a lot of changes, and that has an impact. But if you can get together at least once a quarter and have a really good update on what did we think was going to happen, what actually happened, and where we were right and where were we wrong and why. And what happens is that over time, your people become much better at understanding the future and importantly, the implications of the future, because we don't know for sure. If you ask me, give me the oil price in 3 months. I mean, I can tell you what I think, but there are a whole bunch of things that could happen right now that could change that by 20, 30, 40%. But what I can say is I know that oil is going to move one of two directions, and here's what I do in each case. And what I need to do now is watch.
So what you're saying is that potentially the tech side, then, if you get your SHIT together, you get your stuff together, then you can be more responsive, because then you can scenario plan around those option strategies and effectively use it as more of a dynamic way of managing the feedback loops. Yeah,
exactly.
That's the thing, is you need the feedback loops, you need the data to inform that was the plan. This is the actuals. This is the gap. Mind the gap. What's the year to go? What's the year what's looking back in the rearview mirror? What's looking through the front windscreen? You can then be more robust. But I think the other point I think you made, which is very interesting, is actually then upskilling the team and people being more, you could say, aware or knowing how to handle that variance, or how it could play out. That's like a cultural and strategic skill, isn't it? You suppose you're building.
You're correct that look, the external environment is what's going to drive a lot of changes. Most organizations are very internally focused. So they're looking at the inside and their processes and their optimization and their waste rates. However, they're missing that big piece, which is there's an external element to this that will impact supply and demand. And so what I want organizations to get better at, and we're upskilling them, is understand what are those drivers of supply and demand and see what the leading indicators are, as opposed to always looking at the lagging indicators. So everyone looks at financial statements, and you need to, because that's going to tell you how much you can afford to invest, etc. But it's not enough, and it's late, because I'm looking at the past, what's happened, as opposed to the future, what could be.
Yeah, I think to your point about those reporting cycles as well, is that obviously it depends what kind of industry you're in. My example from before was I was in a retail telco scenario, which was pretty, we were looking at daily KPIs, leading and lagging. Because obviously there's a lot of, it's never quiet, you could say, in that type of environment. But obviously, depending on your industry, then you'll have a different kind of velocity, I suppose, of how you need to look at stuff. But then there's the fiduciary stuff you have to look at anyway, like the monthly accounting cycle, I suppose, and And then the QBR, I suppose the concept of a QBR, quarterly business review or quarterly strategy review, QSR or whatever, is that kind of the thing that you were alluding to earlier?
Correct. Yeah. So you could use that as a QBR, QSR strategy review session, just to say, where did we think we'd be? Where are we? And now, what are we going to do about it? And in both cases, people tend to spend a lot of time on negative deviations. So I'm under budget. But I'm as interested in positive deviations. So if you thought you were going to sell 100 and you sold 140, why did that happen? And, someone will say usually, well, it's because we have a great sales team. We're like, well, hang on a minute. When you're 40% under, you don't say it's because we have a terrible sales team. So why are we not looking at the positive deviations as well and saying, what happened there and where else can we replicate it in the business? So when I see things that are going very well, my first question is, where else could we do that?
Yeah, I mean, that's what you're talking about is a leveling up strategy. I mean, what we used to do before is you probably, I mean, everybody probably listens to this. Have you heard of RAG? That's that red, amber, green, not retrieval augmented generation. That all kind of, that's that tech buzzword. Red, amber, green, like traffic light. We used to have brag. So I don't know if you've heard of brag. Do you know what brag is?
No, I don't actually.
Something I can share some insight for you. So brag was basically blue, red, blue or red, amber, green. So basically, to the point you said about the positive deviation, right? So in a definition that we would have is green, you're on track, yeah. Amber, you're off track, and you've got a plan to get back on track. Red, you're off track, and you've got no plan to get back on track. And blue is you're actually over plan. You're actually overperforming, so you're over indexing. You're over kind of you're kind of celebrating success, basically.
Yeah, that's great. And then my question always comes back to why, and where else can we do that? So if we see that one country or region is well over plan, what's the reason for that? And then could another country replicate it? Or if we say, well, a competitor's in a lot of trouble, so we're getting extra business. Well, where else might a competitor be in trouble? And what does it mean long-term for the market? So I think those signals sometimes are telling us different things than what we might think they're telling us. And it's important to really look at the whys and understand the cause so that we can take the best possible decisions. And organizations, and it's back to how our minds work, we tend to look at the negative and say, let's fix that. But we don't look as much at the positive and say, what's going on there? And if we're plus 40%, could we have been plus 80%? What's happening with the market?
That's the cultural mindset as well, I think, is
right.
One of the things that we used to try and do was at the beginning of every review, you celebrate success. Yeah, so you kind of set the tone of the meeting right from the beginning, rather than actually, because otherwise people then say, "Oh, look at the reds. Let's convert the reds to ambers. Let's convert the ambers to greens. Can we get the greens to blues?" But you get into that detail after you've already started the meeting. I think that actually sets the tone of the brain as well about what you're doing is you're looking for blues and greens and things you can talk about, which sets the tone rather than being like a head down. Oh no, we're off plan, doom and gloom. Yeah. So it's like, I suppose that's the kind of human element of how you performance manage things. One of the things I was thinking about actually was, it's interesting you said about the Financial Times actually, because I remember that that has always been held up as like a living document or a daily document, which is actually a good strategy reference. Which is, it's interesting to hear that you reference that on a daily basis. But one of the things I was also thinking about was the concept of emergent versus planned. If you think about that kind of body of work, with the Henry Mintzberg stuff with Strategy Safari many moons ago, back in 1998, which is nearly quite a few years ago now, isn't it? When that was published. But what's your view on that? Is do you see different people, being very plan orientated, or people being a bit more loose and a bit more emergent? What in the kind of strategy formulation side? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I love that book, by the way. I still have it on my bookshelf. I think it's a good reference.
Same here.
The idea of this planning, I find very difficult to accept in the current global environment. And so again, people like to do planning because it's very inward looking. And then I can plan my CapEx and I can plan my staffing and I can plan my capacity. But back to why I encourage all the organizations that I work with to think about optionality is the reality is you cannot plan like that. So you could make a plan, but the probability that the world will unfold as you expected is very low. And so that's why I encourage more moving towards very flexible approaches. Of course, you still have to have financial targets. You still need to work with your investors. If you're a publicly traded company, you're expected to set targets, which is fine. But just understanding that how you get there may be a number of different pieces. And also, this brings us to the concept of looking not only at our core business, but also our potential growth and exploration opportunities. And to look at those, of course, requires a different mindset, because I cannot plan in an exploration opportunity because I don't know what I'm going to find there. But if I'm not exploring and I'm not curious about new business models, new customers, new approaches, I could miss that next big thing that's coming along. And when we look at a lot of the companies that are in trouble today, they missed what was coming. And because they were so distracted by optimizing their core business, they didn't understand until it was too late that the customers actually moved on to something else. And now you're left with stranded assets.
Is the phrase asleep at the wheel still relevant then for that?
Asleep at the wheel, stranded assets, expectations that are dramatically different. I look at if we talk about retail, I look at the fashion industry and how many retailers have these huge warehouses full of unsold inventory right now because they assumed the world would go one way, it went another way, and now you have all this stuff. There's nobody that wants to buy it, but it didn't need to be that way.
Yeah, and then the question is then how deep they have to cut to sell it through.
Right, and then when you do that, you damage your brand, you damage your brand equity. If you have retail partners, you upset them considerably because you're dumping inventory and they're stuck with a loss. So there's many things to consider in every industry, and that's why I caution against this long-range planning. I just don't think it's appropriate.
I suppose if you think about it, that's where certain, I suppose you could say, functional roles, depends on how much of a voice they have in that discussion. Because, if you think about certain functions around the board table, depending what their backgrounds are, whether if you compare marketing to sales to finance to operations, they've got different views of that planning horizon, haven't they? Because there's obviously different lead times, but there's also this thing about, how are you an elephant or are you a cheetah?
Right. Well, a lot of the elephant and cheetah discussion comes back to organization. And in the example you gave, when you have silos that are really strong and the information is siloized, it's difficult for an organization to act like a cheetah because everybody's self-optimizing for their silo. This isn't new stuff. I mean, Gary Hamel was writing about silos in the 80s. And then I heard him give a great talk at London Business School last year. And what was he talking about? Silos. So he said, I've been standing in the same classroom for 40 years talking about the same thing, and we're in the same place. So can we break down those silos, and can we have people looking at the business as opposed to their department? And then can we stop the sub-optimization? So the purchasing office saying, I'm going to go and buy in Bangladesh because it's $1 a pound cheaper, but without a discussion on we're going to lose 18 months of flexibility in doing that. So are we willing to bet 18 months in advance to save a pound? And so that's again back to how are we aligning people with the overall mission and how are we incentivizing them to perform?
That's great. It's great. You went to a live lecture with Gary, did you?
I did. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, he's great. I mean, he's I mean, God knows how old he is now, actually, but him and C.K. Parlahad, once it wrote those amazing books, and the white space strategy and stuff like that. I mean, some great stuff he's done. But yeah, it's incredible. It's like you probably should do a new version of Strategy Groundhog Day. You wake up on the next day and you still got silos. You still got silos. Still got silos. Will you just talk to each other?
Yeah. There was a journalist from the FT, and they were celebrating 40 years with the paper last week, I think. And they wrote an article, and they pulled out all the archives from the same day 40 years ago and now. And the issues being discussed were almost the same. It was all, like the pound and Europe and the question marks on Ukraine. There were not that many different discussions. So
this
in
was
some ways, this is a wheel.
Well, this was like 1984 or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, was this like a tip to like George Orwell or something?
No, he was just tipping because that was the year he started with the FT. So he was saying, I've been here 40 years and let's, everyone said, oh, the world's so different. So he said, let's just pull up the issues. And most of them were exactly the same. So, I mean, there's nuances that are different, but you had a Middle East crisis, you had a Ukraine crisis, you had Europe and Britain, and will Britain join the Europe, yes or no? You had United States doing their own things, and would they have NAFTA, yes or no? So, I mean, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Go through cycles, don't they, I suppose, yeah. That's cool. That's great. It's good that we can put a George Orwell reference into this episode, actually, because I actually read that book at school. We actually had it in secondary school, and now if you think about this, the Apple ad that Steve Jobs did, with the kind of the marching people, and then if you look, I actually put a post out on Substack, literally yesterday. Was it yesterday or this morning, about Aldous Huxley and his book From Brave New World, about my interpretation of that based on what's going on at the moment. It just shows, if you fast forward or fast back, you got all these things that are actually going on.
No, it's true, and there are a lot of things when we look in popular literature that could show. The one big concern I have, and it's a concern many leaders are talking about, is misinformation. And it was interesting because if you look at Davos, which wrapped up just a couple of days ago now on Saturday, the number one concern that leaders of the Davos organization had this year was misinformation. And that's really interesting because if you go back even just 2 years, misinformation wasn't even the top 20. So there is this issue of misinformation, and your perception is your reality. And if we start to take away tools of fact-checking and objectivity, and many, many claims are being made that are hard to validate, at a certain point, people start to feel overwhelmed of what actually is the reality here. What's truth and what's conspiracy? And that becomes a tricky question. So I think it is important to think about that and to read and reflect on. I mean, Orwell really stressed this misinformation issue in 1984. And if we look at what executives are worried about today, surprise, surprise, it's misinformation.
And incredibly, as we both know, he wrote that in 1948.
Right. It was supposed to be a warning for the future. But this is something I find, Andrew, is, I mean, the assumption I had when I was younger is the internet would be this amazing tool that would allow us to validate facts and use data. And then what we've had is with all the bots and the chat GPTs and different actors, now you have a flood of information that there's no way to verify if it's correct or not. And people do, with algorithms, tend to get trapped in a kind of echo bubble of they're seeing what they want to see, they're hearing what they want to hear, and then the algorithm picks up on that and repeats it.
Yeah, like an echo chamber.
It is an echo chamber. So we have to be careful.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing about the technological influence on society through mismanagement of that, or inappropriate management of that. That's the kind of you could say the not so good outcome for humanity. But yeah, I mean, I think what you're highlighting, because if you think about back to the strategy topic, what you're doing is you're referencing and you're using data points as a way to inform your future strategy, or which path do you go down with this optionality you mentioned. If the actual, what you're saying is that the foundations of that information or those data points is actually potentially, you've got risk of misinformation, you've got risk of toxicity on that data source or that source, then you kind of like you're eating away at the foundations of your strategy plan.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is when I speak a lot with organizations and they talk about transformation or AI, or my first question to them is, have you built a data culture? And some people say, what's that? Or no, we don't need it. Or the fact is, if you want to be successful with technologies that are driven on data, you must create a data culture. And that's hard work. And it's not something that happens. It has to be intentional. And so as you're noting, if I have algorithmic decision-making in my business, if the data that's driving those algorithms are incorrect or incomplete or misleading, then the decisions that my organization comes to will also be incorrect. So it's back to the GJO. When I first started programming a long time ago, they talked a lot about GJO, garbage in, garbage out, and we're back there now. In terms of if you want to use AI agents, great, but those agents are only making decisions based on data. That data is wrong, your decision will be wrong every time, guaranteed.
That's fascinating. Or I call it GIGO. Maybe I should call it GJO.
I don't know.
GJO sounds a bit more Italian, doesn't it? But that's interesting. No, I agree because I was actually reading something about that. Is this whole autonomous agent malarkey that's going on, or wave? The next surfboard wave was supposed to traverse. But it's interesting that I think there was something around this latest DeepSeek, or whatever it's called, or some stuff about the ChatGPT operator, where it's a bit slow. It's only the first version. But also, it's actually, if you do, it's not very good at reasoning yet. It's not good enough at reasoning. So it's good at actual specific task execution because, giving you the kind of heavy lifting, the leg up. But it doesn't know, sometimes it gets a bit confused. It doesn't know what to do on the reasoning side. So I suppose that's something for the future.
Well, you can see that with the automated vehicles. So in Waymo in the United States and San Francisco and Phoenix and Atlanta has been testing these self-driving vehicles essentially because they don't have a driver. And they're pretty cool technologies. I've ridden in them and it's quite impressive. But there have been cases where a bunch of them just stop at an intersection and they're all frozen. Because again, as machines, they get in a loop and if they don't know what to do, especially in a moving vehicle, thankfully they stop.
They just shut down.
But then you've got these roads all blocked because you've got 10 of these self-driving cars sitting there and nobody knows what to do. So we have to think about in our organizations, if we're going to have machines that have autonomy, how do we know they're doing the right thing? And how do we even know the machine is who it says it is and that it has those decision rights? So I think there's a ton of work still to be done on authentication and verification. And it hasn't been thought about that much. I'm sure it will. It sounds like a great business opportunity, though, to really build on this.
Yeah, it's also that thing. It raises a thing about cybersecurity, and also, if you hack the agent, and then you can redivert. There's lots of connotations. Yeah, I know the big tech companies have they're all gone in big. Oh yeah, it's the next wave. It's buy our software, we'll solve the problem. Blah 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 blah. But as you know, it's the change to go from your as is to your to be, or that future state. It's not like flick a switch. It's a lot more. You got to think it through, and you got to think about all the different variations of where it could go, and not just a happy path, but also the unhappy path.
Yeah, well, and this is something that I've been discussing with a number of industry experts, and it's about how do we upskill our people to work in this world alongside technology. And a good number of organizations haven't really thought about it, or they say, oh, we'll have a training program. And it's much more than a training program. So if people are going to work alongside technology, how can we really put 1 + 1 together to make 2.5 so that the person is able to really use that to boost their performance as opposed to slow them down or counteract what it is they're doing? I just don't think that enough thought and energy has been put into that as of yet. And it'll be a hot topic in the next 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I don't know if you know Dan Sodergren. He's written a lot about the future of work, and
Yes.
He was on my other podcast, the PraxiPod, and
Right.
We talked about the kind of the analogy. If you use the right AI tools around that human, then they become 8, 10x more productive. But then from a compensation and benefits point of view, do you pay them to 8 to 10 times more money? The CFO then will have a heart attack or it's like falls dead on the boardroom table because I'm not paying people 8 to 10 times more money. But then the converse of that, which is what I was lucky enough to talk about back in October 2023, what the GoTo conference was about beyond Gen AI. What does it actually mean? It means actually potentially that the CFO and the leadership team can remodel what is the organization look like, an organization structure look like, post actually adopting this type of innovation. And the mix between machine and human may change significantly.
Well, it will. And I was meeting last week in London with the CEO of a bank, and they were talking about what they had seen in terms of real productivity increases as a result of technology. And they were saying, in some areas now we're getting up to 20% productivity increases, which is a lot. So we can do 20% more work without adding any more people, which sounds great. And he said, in the short term, that will be margin. So we will capture that as margin. Longer term, if you think of the implication of this, there's going to be pricing collapse because someone's going to come in and do this cheaper, and then we're going to follow down that road. And so the people who are not ready with this, they'll be out of the market because they'll have prices that can no longer compete. And the people that are still in the market, we're going to have this pricing collapse. But then the question becomes, okay, so all the people that have been displaced by this, where do they go? And I don't know there's an answer to it yet. I'm sure there is one, in the same way that if you remember when Excel and similar software became very popular, there were a lot of predictions that, we'll need 50% less accountants, and the team to do your finance will be 3 people instead of 300. And of course, what happened? The teams are bigger today than they were back then. So we went the opposite direction. So technology does create efficiency, but it also seems to create new opportunities. And I think that's where I'm most interested. What are those opportunities, and how will people take advantage of them so that they're better? And I do still see machines have limitations. So the more we can exploit the machine, the better. As long as we don't get a machine that hears me say that and say, well, let's get rid of the guy that wants to exploit the machine. So there are some guidelines.
We don't need Scott anymore. Yeah, we don't need Scott. He's far too intelligent. He keeps asking difficult questions.
Right, yeah. The 2001 and Hal, when Hal decided that the whole problem was the operator.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what was that? I saw that actually the other day. It's like, no, I can't answer that question. I'm now shutting down.
Yeah, exactly. So we do have to think about guidelines on technology and how we can ensure it's used ethically and safely.
I know that on the G&T session, because we kind of went from me opening up the episode and we jumped straight into the topic. For people that don't know you, Scott, is a chance you could explain a little bit about your journey to where you are today, and why are you so, I suppose, passionate about strategy and the kind of implications of that. Is there something you could share with the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I started my role in Canada in corporate. So I was working for a large company, and that was really interesting. I learned a lot of things, but I saw it wasn't what I wanted to do for all my life. So as many young people do, I went back to school, got an MBA, and like almost all MBAs, went into management consulting. But at the time, I was really into operations. So I was doing a lot of work in Six Sigma, total quality management, process optimization. And then I met who still today is my business partner. He said, no, you don't want to do this. You want to work on strategy. And we had this back and forth for a couple of years. And I said, no, I'm not interested in strategy. And then he finally convinced me that strategy was the guiding light. But in doing so, what I learned is that, long term, everything in organizations are options and everything is relative. So you can change industry, you can change a product, you can change service lines over time, as long as you understand where you're needing to go and you have enough cash and resources to do it. And this got me really interested in how technology comes into play, because obviously you had this huge disruption wave that came with the internet, and then you had another huge disruption wave that is coming along with other technologies. Mobile phone, to me, was a much bigger disruptor than people thought. So the 4G, the 5G, the smartphone completely changed industries and business models. And now we have this new thing coming, which is machine learning. I prefer machine learning to AI because I think AI is a marketing term more than reality. But this got me really interested in how do we create value in businesses. And so that's what I work on today. I work with boards and management teams, as well as investors, on what is the future going to look like? How do we prepare the business for it? And then what decisions should we take and implement so that we're ready for that future, however we see it? And today I see a lot of disruption coming in mobility, even more than we've had up till now. Finance, I believe, is another industry where we're going to see enormous disruption. So I look at finance, and it's similar to me to where the telcos were about 20 years ago, where a lot of value was being captured by the service providers, so a Vodafone or T-Mobile, and then they got commoditized. And so
Telecom Italia in your case.
Telecom Italia is another one. I mean, they were a very big company at one point, and they all got commoditized. AT&T as well, because the value went to the content providers. So an Apple or a Microsoft,
Yeah, the OTTs, the OTT.
yeah, and they captured that value. And so what was left for the telco? Well, providing the backbone, which is a commoditized service.
Or they also got a situation which is the stuff I got involved in, which was basically where you had other brands entering the market and then using them as the wholesale deal because they didn't have their customer relationship. I'm not saying there's a lot of good telco brands out there, but not in every country, not in every geo. You opened up another segment of the MVNOs, which would then capture market share, and obviously then it's another set of fighting around price and value and customer experience.
Absolutely. So that's what I got interested in strategy about. And that's what I work on today. I work with fund managers, investors, board members, CEOs, founders, and we're always looking at the same thing. How do you take decisions for the future, and how do you capture the value that's involved in doing that? Because that's the other issue, is that the historical way of looking at supply chain doesn't work anymore. We really need to look at ecosystems, and the implications of that are quite profound.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I suppose that the thing I was thinking about was, in that journey that you went through, obviously you talked about some of the highlights. What would, so what was the concept that we talk about in the show with, the majority of people we have on the show, which is called peaks and valleys. So people talk about their peaks usually in terms of valleys, or even maybe some peaks and some valleys. What would you share on that?
That's a great question. I mean, I think one big valley for me was, as with many people in the industry, was 2008. Things were going pretty well up till 2006. The warning signals started to go on in 2007. Then 2008 comes around and boom, there's massive layoffs. The economies in the Western countries are collapsing. And this was a real valley to me in terms of, so much energy and effort put into things that then were crumbling. And so the question then is, well, how do you build organizations that are resilient even in times of great shock? And so that was a real eye-opener for me on thinking about, what do you do? So in my career, I saw the big market crash in the end of the 80s. Then we had 2000, 2001, .com blew up. Then we had 2008, financial crisis. And now we've had this kind of 15-year period of somewhat financial stability. But my question is, what's going to blow up next? And if you look through history, this has always happened. There is not a period where you don't have this big drop. And so one of the things that drives me is, how do you build that resilient organization? And I believe part of the answer of that is technology.
And where are we on that curve? Because you said obviously that there's been a period between 2008 and then obviously I don't know if you ignore the thing about COVID, or was that just like an anomaly, or was that part of the cycle? Or was that, because you can see a bit like it's like a little, I mean, it's quite a big hiccup. But obviously that changed quite some fundamental things as well, didn't it?
Well, COVID was I don't want to minimize COVID because it was a disaster for many people. And it was a personal disaster, maybe more than an economic one. In terms of, if you looked at the big economies, there was a hiccup with COVID, but actually the recovery from it was very quick. So it was not, 2008, I would argue the Eurozone still has not recovered from 2008. It was much faster to get on that recovery cycle, but Europe is not there even today. Whereas COVID was a fairly fast economic bounce back. So not discounting the human tragedy, but if you look at the economy, it moved some numbers around, i.e. we bought more stuff from Amazon and we bought fewer airplane tickets, but the overall numbers in the bucket didn't change that much, other than countries accumulated a lot of extra debt. So we'll see how that's going to work out long term. And of course, when you have debt without productivity, what do you get? You get inflation. And many of the geopolitical choices that have been arrived at, I believe, are in part due to that inflation. But as a company, I cannot do much about external inflation other than be ready for it and understand how I'm going to respond to it. I cannot phone up the ECB and say, what are you guys doing? I would love to, but they're not taking my call. So what I can do though is say, okay, here's how the ECB is going to act. Here's what it means, and now what do we do?
No, that's great, and yeah, I agree. But yeah, what you're saying is that so the cycle that we're at now, as we're entering 2025, where are we on that? Where are we in that cycle compared to those major events you mentioned before? What should be on that?
Yeah, well, that's the trillion-dollar question. I mean, if you could answer that, you'd beat all the hedge funds in the city. Now, I mean, where do I think we're at on the cycle? I think that we do have a risk that we're getting close to another disruptive event. What would trigger that? It could be something.
A black swan event, you mean?
It could be a black swan event, or it could be something more predictable, meaning that, I mean, the Middle East is very important to all of us. And if that became less stable than it is today, then all bets are off, meaning we don't have a plan to deal with that other than let's cut costs. What I hear a lot of CEOs and boards talking about is understanding business cycles. And so for their industry saying, where are we in the business cycle? And then how do we manage the expenses? So where we're trending down, how fast can we reduce those costs? And where we're trending up, how quickly can we increase that supply? And I think that's the right way to be looking at it, really, is for your industry, for your geographies, where are you in the cycle? And it's not the same for everywhere. Asia's in a very different position than Europe, for example.
And then, no, that's great. Thank you for sharing that. That's very useful. I think it highlights kind of you can't take your eye off it. I suppose the other thing I was going to say to you was about if you're, so some of the people that listen to this podcast are obviously, we've had quite a lot of founders on, founders of companies, which are maybe at early stage, versus kind of people who are in corporate. So there's obviously enterprise versus, fast growth or emerging organizations. Are there any kind of lessons you would say or any kind of learnings or recommendations that are common between those two different types of organizational maturity, you could say, or Maslow's hierarchy? No, not Maslow's hierarchy.
Yeah.
What Greiner's model of growth? Remember Greiner's model of growth, the discontinuity.
Yeah.
Versus, what's common and what's different. I suppose, any thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, I have a role. I'm a lead mentor at Techstars. And so I've worked with a number of founders. I also have some work we do with scale up. So VC funds, early stage seed funds, etc. Yes. I mean, the first thing I say to founders is really be careful with your cash flow. So don't let a VC or an investor get you to spend more money than you need to spend, because that's in their interest. It's not in yours. So be very, very careful where you're spending money. And then as well, just as I said with larger organizations, think in terms of options. So until you know you have product market fit, don't begin to invest in scaling. And it's a mistake I see a lot of organizations make is they get a few customers, they have some revenue coming in, and they say, right, let's scale. But they don't know that they have product market fit yet, and they usually don't. And so then they end up spending all this money and they don't have the results to show for it. And they get churn of customers because customers are coming in and then it's not the right product for them. And so they're leaving and you have this churn, and that's just going to cause a whole bunch of problems for everybody. So what I recommend to founders is understand better than anyone else your customer and stay as close to your customer as you can. Don't worry about the rest. When you're early stage, all that matters is your customer and how quickly you can get revenue from them and from the right customer. So they want to stay with you and they want to keep paying for and using your product. And that's where I still see a lot of opportunity is I meet founders and they're all caught up in how do I write the best pitch deck and how do I raise money? And if you have revenue and you're growing, everybody's going to be, you don't need a pitch deck. Everyone's going to be banging on your door, attempting to be your next investor. So what you need to understand is how do you get revenue? How do you build that revenue? And why will those customers love you? And when you have that, then you've answered the magic problem. And that's where I think that founders still have a lot of opportunity to improve and where they're frankly sometimes getting really poor advice.
Yeah, I mean, what you've just raised there of some fundamental foundational items. But yeah, I mean, my experience is that some founders go down massive rabbit holes, which is very distracting. And there's a lot of people trying to get time with them to give them their opinion on where they should go. But, what you've highlighted, I think, is very strong. Thank you for that.
I think it always comes back to what's the problem you're solving. Too often you see that people get in love with the technology or what they can do with the technology, and they build this solution. It's like the movie, Field of Dreams, build it and they will come. Well, movies are not real life, and you can build these huge stadiums and then nobody turns up. And so I think that's the concern I have is I see founders putting a lot of time and money and they're building things and that's all their energy. It's just like, well, how many people have that problem?
They're polishing and building their spaceship.
Correct. Yeah. And nobody wants to go to space. So that's where I think a founder, the more close they can stay to the customer and the more they can understand the problem that customer has, and then look for a solution that has a lot of problem customers. So that's another thing I see is they're niching into too small of a market. And then if their idea is to scale, it won't scale. But then we could also talk about, should you even scale? It all depends what type of investors you have. You don't need to scale a business to make a great business.
Yeah, but that problem there, you see, is if you're not a unicorn, then you're just nowhere.
Well,
that was me being facetious, by the way.
Right. No, but this is obviously if I get venture capital investors, they need these enormous returns because they have to pay back their investors and so on and so on. And there's risk. There's a lot of risk in venture. But if I'm building a company, do I necessarily need to build $1 billion company? No, I could build a great $100 million company that spins off $10 million a year after tax. And if I have 80% of that business, I'm going to be living very, very well. And this is something I talk to a lot of founders about is because they're saying, well, I want to get venture capital. Say, well, hang on a minute. In my experience, venture as an asset class is investable for about 0.1% of businesses. And so if you're taking venture money and you're not a venture business, it's going to screw up your strategy because your external investors who are also board members have an objective that just doesn't match with what your industry is or what your business is.
But isn't that a problem? I've noticed that definitely markedly in the last 5 to 10 years, where there is kind of like I don't know, I don't want to say showboating, but I will say showboating. Well, what's the size of my seed round? What's the size of my Series A? There's a bit of that about, but actually what is the right sizing capital wise for the, because you can overfund, you can underfund. Yeah. How do you right size the cash injection or the capitalization of the business? And actually, to your point, if you get the bits right at the beginning, if you understand the customer and you understand where the problems are and you understand where they're prepared to pay money for it, actually you could create a business where you don't actually have to take any external capital because it becomes self-fulfilling. That's the nirvana, I suppose, where you don't have to dilute or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, the ideal world is one where the founders retain more equity. So what I remind every founder is equity is the very most expensive form of capital you have. Understanding where you want to use debt, where you want to use equity, and where you frankly don't have to spend the money. So I see some organizations, they'll go out and they'll blow unbelievable amounts of money on advertising. It's just, do you need to do that? And is that a good return for you? Probably not. And that comes back to, does the founder clearly understand their long-term investor roadmap? And do they understand their route to customer acquisition? Because going out and dropping a bunch of money on Google or Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever, or television ads, we are about to see the Super Bowl where every year you see some company that's going to blow $10 million in 3 minutes, and by next year they'll be bankrupt. And it's like, was that a good use of money? Probably not at all. And so then understanding what are the ways that you can reach your customer without having to dilute your equity? Because frankly, I think investment with equity for marketing and communications is not a good deal in almost any industry.
Yeah, how do you make sure you control your cost of acquisition, your CAC,
exactly,
et cetera, and make sure you worked out your LTV. But obviously you need to get some traction before you can start to look at that data. But yeah, interesting. That's cool. I love that little diversion about understanding what's common and what's different. Yeah, a lot of the things you talked about are fundamentally foundational across whether you're a startup or you're a large organization. You got to get your arms around those things as well.
Every founder, every CEO, every investor they all have their assumptions about the future, but have they made those clear? Have they tested them and then linked that to what they believe the implications are? And if the answer is no, then you have a risk that you're building a business based on an assumption that is incorrect or untrue.
Absolutely fantastic. So one of the things I was just going to say was, I mean, obviously we could traverse quite a lot of topics today.
Yeah.
But I really appreciate you coming on the show. And I suppose if for people that are interested in kind of picking up with you as a follow-up to, maybe, even collaborate with you in the future, what's the best way of finding Mr. Newton on the Tinternet, as they call it?
Super. Well, I have because I live in Italy, I have one claim to fame. I am the only Scott Newton in Italy. So if you go into your LinkedIn browser, I'm quite active on LinkedIn. Type Scott Newton Italy, you'll see me pop up right away. And feel free to follow what I'm doing. I have all my contact information there. So that's the easiest way that anyone that wants to get in touch with me is welcome to do so. And Andrew, I really appreciate the opportunity to be on the show. This has been a great conversation and a lot of unexpected twists, as you'd say.
No, sure, no problem. Thanks. It's cool. Thank you for coming on the show. I thought you were going to tell me actually you got like an Italian pseudonym. You were called like Pierluigi Newtononi or something like that, or Butoni.
Not that I know of.
Maybe you should do that on LinkedIn. You should have this this alter ego, this Italian alter ego. The Count of where are you? You're between Venice and Milan.
Yes, yeah, I'm in the Veneto region in the northeast.
Yeah, I'm sure you can make some kind of it's not the Count of Monte Cristo. It's the Count of Strategy, the Italian Count of Strategy. There you go.
I'll run that by my wife and see what she thinks about that.
Anyway, that was lovely to see you again, and thanks for coming on the show. That was Scott Newton, who is a very interesting strategist, and obviously he's just shared his information about how you can find him in the wine region of Italy, where the wine and pasta, lovely food. And that was Andrew Turner, founder and host of the G&T Sessions podcast. Thank you very much for coming on the show, and see you soon.